Communications here at IATA again. Welcome back to this weekly briefing. We appreciate you joining us each week. This briefing will focus on traffic numbers that we have for the month of May. Our Chief Economist, Pearce, will deliver a short presentation explaining what the numbers are telling us. Then we'll have a few comments by our Director General, Alexandre Juniac. And then, as usual, we'll take questions using the chat function. So with that, Brian, would you like to take the floor, please?
Thank you very much, and good day to everybody. So we've now got data in on May air travel, and you can see here from the blue line, which shows global RPKs, revenue passenger kilometres flown. The good news is that we did see a rise in May from the April low point to a level of around about 55 billion passenger kilometres flown. Typically, though, you can see that we would normally expect at this time of year something like 700 billion. In percentage terms, back in April, which looks to be the low point, we saw a fall relative to last year of 94%. In May, it was 91.3% down. So an improvement, but as you can see, it's not a very noticeable improvement. And in particular, it has lagged behind the rebound that we've seen in global business confidence. And these global business confidence measures are typically very well correlated to GDP growth, which is a key driver for air travel. So what's going on here now? Why haven't we seen a more significant rise in air travel? Well, I think perhaps the main reason is that we've still got a substantial number of travel restrictions. International border restrictions are only just starting to be relaxed, as you can see from this map here. The darker the blue, the more restrictive the restrictions on travel are. We know that roughly 20% of countries are starting now to ease restrictions, but there are still 65% where borders are just completely closed to international air travel. So, we really need the relaxation of those restrictions before we see a significant rebound in travel. And what we can see is that it really has been domestic air travel that drove the moderate rise that we saw in May. You can see, at the bottom of that chart, all of the regions' international air travel saw no improvement at all in May. They were all between 98.2 and 98.9% down on where they were last year, which was pretty much the same as April. The main driver for the improvement, of course, is China domestic, which is now, so RPKs flown within China are now 49.9% down on where they were last year, which is a significant improvement in where we were a few months ago. And as you can see, there's a modest improvement in the US. We've also seen some improvements in other Asian domestic markets, although they're too small really to impact the global totals. But nonetheless, it is an encouraging sign that once lockdowns ease, there is some pent-up demand for air travel. But in flying these passengers, airlines are finding the load factors are incredibly low. We've actually hit in May a new all-time low for load factors at just over 50% at the global level. But one encouraging statistic is that in the domestic China market, we've seen a fairly significant improvement in the load factors as the planes have started to fill up in the China domestic market as travel has picked up. And as you can see, we're just under 70% load factors. Certainly not anywhere near the peak, but approaching more normal levels. But obviously, the Chinese market has been rather ahead of anyone else. Looking ahead at one of the key forward-looking indicators that are used really to anticipate economic growth are the business confidence measures, and these all look very positive. We've certainly seen a recovery in China, and in other major markets, we've seen businesses' confidence improve very significantly to levels that are consistent with a reasonably strong rebound in the economy, in GDP. And as we know, GDP is a very important driver for air travel. This would also lead us to think that business travel would be rebounding fairly strongly. Unfortunately, that element, which is a key driver of industry profitability, may be absent in the first part of the restart, the reopening of markets. At least that is what surveys have been telling us, that corporates are going to be very cautious about travel in the future. But, confidence is up amongst businesses. That might mean that there are some surprises there on the upside. But of course, by far the majority of air passengers travel for leisure or visiting friends and family. And there the picture is not quite so positive because consumer confidence, in contrast to business confidence, is still very low. We've seen some pickup in China in May and early June, blue line there. But as you can see, other key markets, the US, the UK, Germany, we've really not seen consumer confidence pick up at all in some cases from the lows reached in April. And obviously, to see a significant pickup in leisure travel, we're going to need to see more confidence amongst consumers and passengers. And clearly, by May, there weren't signs that was built. Indeed, another factor which is affecting those travel figures and the relatively small recoveries we saw in May is the recent rise that we've seen in the number of coronavirus cases. As you can see, as we moved into June, there was a significant pickup in the number of cases. And while bookings, which you can see in the red line at the bottom of that chart, while bookings, certainly in the early part of June, were continuing to slowly pick up. And indeed, on average, we think that bookings in June were 77% down on the year earlier compared to the previous month, May, 86% down. So on average, June looks as though it was better than May and would support a further improvement in travel in the June figures. But as you can see, there was a dip in bookings in the second half of June as coronavirus cases picked up, and this was particularly associated with travel in China, where there has been a resurgence. So, this is causing us to be rather cautious about prospects in the next few months. If we look in more detail at the coronavirus, the COVID-19 cases, you can see from the chart on the left that there's an issue here in the emerging markets, perhaps excluding China. These numbers here exclude China. In the developed markets, the situation looks much better, with the one exception, of course, of the US, where we've started to see some significant increase in cases. And I guess so this raises the issue of whether this increase in cases will delay the opening of borders to international travel beyond what we had expected in our existing forecasts. And the pie chart shows really the relevant markets, because not all emerging markets are seeing rising cases, but around half of them by RPKs are. And if those markets remain closed by the end of the for the rest of the year, and if the US market, international markets, remain closed, that represents about 37% of global RPKs. So it is quite a significant proportion of travel. And in the final slide, we've looked at that 37% segment and looked at the implications for the rest of this year and our expected profile for RPK growth if those markets remained closed for the rest of this year. So as you can see, it's not our baseline forecast, which we released a week or so ago, which is that the blue line there, where we saw April as the low point and a recovery, relatively modest, but a recovery nonetheless to a level in December, which would be 36% below where we were in December last year. But that was assuming that there would be an opening of those markets by the end of the year. If they don't, if that 37% of RPKs represented by those emerging markets and the US international markets, if they don't open, then there is a downside risk to that profile. We would still expect to see an improvement in air travel, but not as strong as we have been expecting in the baseline forecast. We could be at a position by the end of the year where we're something like 53% down on a year earlier. So the main numbers show we have seen an improvement. Things are heading in the right direction, but I think there are some reasons to be cautious about the pace of improvement here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. Now I'd like to ask our Director General, Alexandre Juniac, to give a few comments before we open it up for questions.
I think Tony, we can open for questions now. I think it's more relevant. First questions coming.
All right. At this point, we have one question in the queue. It says Latin America has 3 big players in Chapter 11. Avianca Latam, since yesterday, Aeromexico joined that group. Many airlines of the region are still closed to travel. What are your thoughts on the impact of connectivity in Latin America? What do you think will happen with other players, and will they have what will they have to do in order to survive? And is Chapter 11 an option? Sorry, it's quite a long question.
The impact of the coronavirus in Latin America is probably the highest in the world, perhaps comparable to Africa. But in terms of the financial health of the airlines, it's probably the region in which we have the most, almost among the most threatened airlines. And in terms of connectivity, it's a disaster, obviously.
And do you think that Chapter 11 will be a viable option for revitalizing that region?
Chapter 11 gives you the opportunity, to restructure your business, your activity, your cost, in accordance with the new features of your business. So it's a very effective and efficient tool to do this type of adaptation. So yes, it's a good tool.
What we haven't seen in the Latin America region is very much aid from governments,
except in Brazil.
Yeah, with some exceptions.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question about long-haul travel. It says, with Emirates restarting flights using the A380, do you see this as a sign of a return of long-haul travel by large airlines?
The sign is not using a type of aircraft or another one. The sign of a return in traffic in long haul will be when there will be more and more routes reopening. The type of aircraft has absolutely no influence, from my point of view, on the fact that the international traffic is open or not.
And at the moment, we're seeing it's really short-haul travel. I mean, we've seen domestic markets open. We're seeing most of the border openings between neighbouring countries with travel corridors and travel bubbles. I think we still think that long haul is going to be, the last to open.
Okay. We have a question on, Brian, your figure of 53% as the potential downside of what we would expect at the end of the year. The question is asking for a precision on that. Is that a global market share figure, or how is that calculated?
So we're saying that, and obviously there's a large error band around all of these estimates, but when we looked at the impact of international markets between those emerging markets with rising COVID cases and the US international market remaining closed for the rest of the year, it took roughly 20 percentage points off the end year growth that we were expecting relative to a year ago.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about, I guess, airline failures. The question is, we're months into the crisis now. There have been some failures, but most airlines are still hanging on. How much worse does IATA think the situation will get before it improves? And in terms of airline failures, have they just really delayed the inevitable and we can expect more failures in the future?
I think we've seen in Latin America that in the absence of substantial government aid, it's very difficult for airlines to survive. I think the fact that we haven't seen substantial failures around the world is because actually governments have been providing substantial aid. The last time we counted this, it was over $120 billion. But as airlines begin to restart, begin to fly again, begin to operate only a small portion of their fleet, but take on all of the costs that entails, have to pay for the servicing of the debt that they've accumulated. Revenues are likely to be weak. I think the economics are going to be very tough at the beginning of the recovery period. I think it's there's a substantial risk of more airlines failing in that environment.
Okay. We have a question on the decision yesterday by the Council of ICAO to define the CORSIA baseline at 2019 levels. The question has a few parts to it. First, it asks to confirm that this is what IATA wanted, and is that getting criticism from environmental critics? And the next part of it is there a risk of CORSIA fragmenting and regional schemes like the ETS being reestablished as a result of this criticism?
The ETS is still working.
Yes, but it's domestic.
It's just for the European market, but we think that the decision made by the ICAO Council yesterday is reasonable. reasonable in two senses. First of all, it maintains, the commitments that the airlines have made now for 10 years at the same level, showing that we are keen to sticking to these commitments and to make that. First of all, and secondly, they are reasonable because they correspond to an objective that is reachable on the long run, which is at the end of the day the key issue. The key issue is to be able to reduce our CO2 emissions significantly and effectively, and that reference, which is 2019 emissions, allow the airlines to reach these commitments that are very ambitious effectively, which is the key point, that it works practically.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about the US. It says, how far have you modeled the impact of a slower opening of US and other international markets? What sort of impact on revenue might there be, and who suffers the most? European network carriers? And I guess the other question that's associated with this is, are you disappointed that the EU's notional banned list continues to bar US travel for most people?
I take the first bit.
The first part?
Part. So we have modelled the impact of the US international travel remaining closed. Some of the earlier slides looked at that. I mean, for the European, the EU, including the UK, to the US is a $29 billion market, or at least it was in 2019, so roughly 5% of global revenue. So, if that market remains closed, that is significant, probably more significant for the European airlines, for which international business is a larger portion than the US airlines, where the domestic market is the key thing.
And on the second part of the question, I was disappointed about the decision of the EU. The decision to reopen borders for any part of the world, and in particular the EU, has to be driven by several factors, and the fact and limiting the risk to re-import of infection is one of the possible parameters that the governments have to take into account, and we see this similar decisions or similar caution or cautious decisions being made in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia, when we see the way that Asian countries are reopening their borders between themselves within the Asia-Pacific region. So there is a good balance or a good compromise to find between the need to reopen, to restart the air traffic, to restart the economy and to boost the economic recovery, and the need for an approach to limit the transmission of the virus from one country to another, or one region to another, and that's understandable.
And Alexandre, maybe just on the methodology that the European Union is using, you're comfortable with that?
I would like to be a specialist in virology to be able to judge that. Frankly, it's difficult to have a strong and scientific opinion on that without being a specialist. I am not a specialist of virology.
Okay. But I suppose the point would be that it should be guided by science rather than by politics.
That's for sure. That's for sure. It must be scientifically based. But we know that in this pandemic, science has some. So there are also uncertainties in the scientific approaches and criteria and opinions, and diverging opinions. So it's not there is not a 100% bulk of certainties approaching this issue.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question, I think, for Brian on the May traffic figures. And the question says that for particularly the international flights, many of those would have been for repatriation purposes and thus not reflective of actual demand. How does that, I guess, figure into the conclusions that and the analysis that we've done on what happened in May?
Yes, you're quite right. I mean, there was still roughly 2% of international RPKs being flown in May. The figure was down 98.3% for international. So the vast majority of those flights, those passengers will have been repatriation flights. So those are exceptional one-off flights. It is not reflective of any underlying demand for air travel. So there's not very much that we can learn from the May international figures on the strength of demand for air travel. But I think the domestic numbers do give us some guide, and in particular the Chinese market has risen fairly substantially. It has dipped in recent weeks because of the outbreak in COVID-19 cases, but there has been a very encouraging rise in both RPKs to minus 49.9%. In these circumstances, that's a very good figure. But also load factors in the domestic Chinese market are up to 68.8%. So that is certainly moving in the right direction. We need to see international markets opening in order to get further progress, though.
Thank you, Brian. We have a question that starts by asking about job losses. We've seen massive job losses announced by the likes of EasyJet, Ryanair, BA. Also yesterday, Airbus made a big announcement. Do we see these announcements continuing? And do we see, I suppose...
I think this is reflective of the fact, our expectation is that the industry is going to be, and demand for air travel and air transport is going to be smaller for several years before it returns to 2019 levels. So I think these are, rational responses. We need a smaller industry to serve the smaller market.
There's a resizing of the industry, following the drop in demand and the drop in traffic and the drop in revenues. So this resizing, unfortunately, means some significant, layoff and restructuring in many airlines, as we have seen in Europe, but also in the Americas, in Asia. So it's unfortunately it will probably continue.
Okay. The questioner then asks, will there also be fewer airlines in the future?
Probably yes. The shrinkage of the sector is not only the shrinkage of each airline, but also the reduction of the number of actors in our industry. That's highly probable. We have answered several times the question on that, and it will probably lead to a fewer number of actors, plus a consolidation around the most solid or strongest one.
Okay. And then the questioner asks about, I suppose it's the government aid that's being offered to airlines and the renationalization that's the result of that. Do we expect a return to the days before the low-cost carriers, like in the 1990s, when the market was dominated by very large airlines, or do we anticipate there'll be new low-cost entrants coming in?
We do not anticipate at this time a significant change in the structure of the industry. I mean, between the low cost and the full service, or the national historic full service carriers. You will still have strong low cost companies. You will also have strong legacy carriers coexisting, probably, and as it is a lively industry, we can expect that in the coming years, some of the disappearing actors will be replaced by newcomers, as it has always happened. Whether they are full service or low cost, all possibilities are on the table. It's difficult to predict now, and it will depend on the region, on the country, on the type of market they want to address.
Yeah. But I think the question does raise an important point about with more government involvement in airlines, will the industry be as responsive to the needs of consumers as it has been in the last couple of decades in quite a liberalised environment? And I guess competitive pressures will still be very strong. Yeah. So that will typically mean that airlines will be, whether government controlled or still in the private sector, will give consumers what they want. Otherwise, they will go to a competitor. But the rise in government ownership, I think, is a concern. In that it might affect the way that that airlines are making decisions. So it's certainly an important issue.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about transit travel. So do we believe that in future the trend will be more towards direct flights than to indirect flights via transit hubs? And I guess connected to that, what do we see as the risk to transit hubs? And in particular, do we see, the question is from Hong Kong, do we see any implications of this for Hong Kong going forward?
Well, I think initially hubs are going to struggle, and airlines that rely on connecting traffic are going to struggle with many markets being closed. And so, it will be difficult in the initial stages to get the critical mass to make many routes viable. But once we see a more general opening of markets, we're going to have a smaller overall demand. I would have thought hubs will still be essential, but it might be that it will be the stronger hubs around which the focus is.
Okay, thank you. We have a question coming from the U.S. It says that the U.S. Senate recently heard from top advisors, government medical advisors, that they were unsure if air travel was safe. And the question is, what is IATA or other industry associations doing to get the message to these critical advisors, the medical community, about the air safety measures that the industry is taking?
First of all, we are advocating in favor of the set of measures that have been taken with the input of the medical community, and especially WHO within the framework of ICAO, the CART report or the CART measures. Everybody must remember that the contribution of the medical community has been absolutely key and integrated to give some medical robustness and credibility to this set of measures, to ensure that they are protective and that they minimize the risk of transmission of the virus. Secondly, we advocate government and everybody in the government in favor of implementing these measures, demonstrating that they are positive in terms of reducing the risk, the transmission risk. And thirdly, we are also participating into research program to consolidate these results, and show that the risk of virus transmission, especially on board, is limited. We are financing and contributing to a lot of investigation and surveys on that with international bodies or very high-level agencies.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about what passengers are seeking in terms of making them feel more comfortable flying again. Does IATA have any insights on what passenger expectations are?
So in terms of what? In terms of
temperature screening, testing, those types of things. I guess maybe we can preface it by saying at next week's briefing, we will be releasing some data that we've collected in the passenger survey. But in the meantime, Alexandre, maybe you wanted to give some high-level comments?
What we have tried to set up by recommending and now implementing the CART report and measures is the best possible compromise between something that is reasonable, acceptable by passengers, and something that is really safe, protecting safety and minimizing the risk of transmission. So. Having safety as the key priority for the airline, as it has always been. So that's what we are doing, every day. We're also recommending, and the CART is totally open to that, to maintain, the evolution of the CART alive, even after the report has been given or the conclusion has been drawn, to adapt either to the feedback we receive from the measures we have implemented, positive or whether it's positive or negative, and to adapt to the evolution of the scientific of science. And particularly, we have insisted on the need to pay attention very, very carefully to the evolution of the test system, knowing that a lot of insurance or safety or comfort could be given by a very reliable, fast, comfortable, scalable test system applicable to a broader number of passengers. And this level of comfort would be given not only to passengers, but will be also given to governments. So it's an adaptative model on which we are relying, and we are perfectly conscious of that and open to necessary modification, if any, and if needed.
Okay, thank you. We have a follow-up to the question about our outreach to the medical community. The questioner says, yes, it's understood that there was medical advice in developing the CART recommendations and the takeoff guidance, but it doesn't seem that all national health or national public health authorities have understood that. So are we outreaching directly to the public health authorities as well?
First of all, there are two elements in this question. The first one is you have probably noticed that there is no total 100% medical consensus about what has to be done. First of all, even among the health authorities, there is not a 100% consensus in terms of what has to be done, what approach to take, how to control. As I said, there are some differences based on the uncertainties that are linked with this new virus, first of all. And secondly, what we do to convince governments to implement the CART report or the takeoff report, when we advocate it, we advocate, of course, with our traditional counterparts, mainly the transportation, the Civil Aviation Authority, Transportation Ministry, but we also try to reach government authorities or single points of contact that have been designated by government to to be the link between the aviation world and the rest of the public authorities involved in these policy, and especially the health authorities. It's what has been done with our leader state, initiative, in which we have asked 20 states to appoint a single point of contact that would make the link between the aviation or the industry and all the government and public authorities of each country involved in this anti-COVID fight and health policy. So it includes the health authorities.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about the load factors in May. You mentioned, Brian, that they were at an all-time low, but maybe can you give some color? Are there differences between regions or anything else that we should take from it than they were very low?
I can. I mean, on domestic markets, they were. The 50% was really driven by domestic markets. On average, domestic load factors were just under 57%, certainly highest in China at 68.8%. I mean, we did see some improvement in the US domestic market in traffic, but US airlines are flying around at the moment with load factors of less than 40%, which is unlikely to be profitable. And on international markets, load factors were 28.6%. These numbers are less meaningful when there are just such a few aircraft flying on international markets. But certainly, in order to break even, load factors would have to be considerably higher than this.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from India. We've seen the Indian domestic market restart. How much of an impact will that have on the overall global prognosis for the industry? And do we have any comments on what's going on in India?
So it's welcome to see the restart. India is one of those really important markets for the future. A country with more than a billion people, but at the moment relatively few people flying compared with other economies, even compared with China. So the restart there is not going to be materially affecting the global numbers at the moment, but clearly, it's certainly a very important market for the future.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about financing. The question says that U.S.-based airlines have been very active in raising financing since the start of the crisis, by volume more than any other region. Why do you think this is?
Because they were more solid financially, first of all. So they were able to attract some funds, whether it's from debt or capital.
Yeah, and more recently, the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of airlines out there, particularly US airlines, raising equity.
Absolutely.
So that's really helped improve their balance sheets. So one of our worries is that the industry is going to be starting flying again, burdened with very high levels of debt and the obligations to pay interest and repay that debt. So airlines desperately need more equity financing to strengthen their balance sheets. And we've seen the US airlines, but also a number of other airlines. There have been airlines in Europe and Asia that have also been raising equity in the last couple of weeks, which is an encouraging sign. But it has been, a relatively small number of airlines that have been able to do this.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. We have a question about slots. A few weeks ago, IATA called for slot waivers to be extended into the winter season. What is the reception of that been by governments? And what's the deadline for that decision to be made?
We have contacted almost every government, to extend the waiver they have granted to the airline to maintain their slot, or not to use the 80-20 use it or lose it rule. And we are waiting for the answer. The sooner we have the answer, the better. But we still have some weeks ahead of us to have the decision being made by the governments.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about government support, and particularly in the Middle East. Some time ago, IATA voiced its concern about the lack of sufficient government financial support for airlines in the Middle East and Africa. Has anything changed since we made that announcement? Has the level of support increased? And what is IATA's current outlook for those two regions, Africa and the Middle East?
It's more for Africa than. Because we have seen what we said about the lack of support was probably more relevant for Africa than for Middle East. In Middle East, some states have heavily supported their carriers, which was not the case for Africa. Also, because in many African countries, the states, local governments, didn't have enough financial means to support effectively the airlines. So that's the reason why we have also written, in conjunction with other associations or authorities, to international development agencies to finance the support of airline and more generally of the tourism and travel sector in Africa through these international organizations. So that's it.
Okay, thank you. We have one last question in the queue, so if anyone wants to ask any more questions, please type them in quickly. If not, the last question will be a follow-up on the earlier question about hubs. And the question is, how slowly might hubs struggle as they try and get the critical mass to make routes viable? Are we seeing 1 year, 2 year, 6 months?
I think it depends on where they are. If we see more widespread openings in Europe, then there are lots of city pairs that will need to be connected through hubs because they have too small a flow of direct passengers, and there's probably a better chance that those hubs can be adequately served in that region. For longer haul traffic, there may be more difficulty, or at least it may be slower for the markets at both ends of those longer haul routes connecting through a hub to open. So again, really, this is largely in the hands of governments and getting in place a consistent set of measures that are being advocated by ICAO, and also getting back consumer confidence. I think that there is certainly initially passengers and consumers will perhaps stay closer to home until confidence builds enough to get a restoration of these longer haul markets. So we're probably talking a year or so out for some of these longer haul market hubs.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We've had a couple of last questions come in. So very quickly, the second last question talks about slots again. It says they understand that ACI has expressed some reservations about blanket slot relief. How well is IATA and ACI working on this issue? And I suppose more importantly, how aligned are airlines and airports on this issue?
We are working closely with ACI to have a common approach on this On this slot rule, still working, and we hope to reach a result with the airport.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's important to note that we're partners. So at the end of the day, we need to have a decision or a result that allows both of us to get through this crisis.
Yeah.
So the last question then is about ticket fares. And it's wondering, have we noticed any trends in fares as the crisis has come this far? And what are we seeing going forward?
Let me comment initially. I mean, it's obviously very difficult to interpret what's happening in markets that are only just opening up. What we've seen in the Chinese domestic market is that airlines needed to discount fares to try to stimulate some demand from air travel. But I think we're also seeing that airlines are starting up their operations facing some increases in costs because of the health measures being put in place, which will reduce the utilization of aircraft, sometimes utilization of seats. So that's what makes the economics of flying in these early stages so difficult, because low fares and higher costs don't go very well together.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Brian. That's the last question we have in the queue, and we're just about at the hour. So with that, we'll call this briefing to a close.